with our actual Rhino work today. I know that took a little bit of time, but I think we could still make it through in our scheduled time today with Rhino. And actually today we're going to focus primarily on VRay. But before I get into that, I want to take a quick step back and one, apologize that we're making a pivot mid semester, but two, I think a lot of you already figured this out, but I'm switching all of the stuff that you're going to turn in over to being on Canvas. I found out from the higher ups that because of accreditation issues, they want everything to be turned in through Canvas so that they can go back and look at the Canvas shell and make sure and audit that everything was done appropriately. So that means that I have to have you turn everything in through Canvas. So I implore you to have some patience with me as we shift a little bit. Apparently 14 years of doing it for my own website was the end. So you're going to be, from now on, everything that you turn in will be turned in through the Canvas system. The grades will be through the Canvas system. I will still record all of my lectures through basically the Zoom recording, and then I'll post them to YouTube. So those are public. You can see them. You can log into YouTube and see them. I'll post the links to them. I also am going to continue to maintain the website. You all have your logins to my website anyway. That has a lot of the tutorials on it, and I'm not going to repost those on Canvas. Those will live on the digital tool site. So you have your logins. You can see that. I had a great question about, do you need to repost your things that you've already turned in? No, you don't need to repost the things that you've already turned in. I should have gotten through and graded everything that you already turned in. If somehow I missed something, just shoot me an email and say, hey, or a Canvas message and say, hey, I already turned it in, and I'll go in and check it off. So you don't need to repost anything that you've already posted. I've gotten that taken care of. The grades are migrated, but going forward, everything should be just on Canvas. I also restricted all of the accounts on my website, the digital tool site, so that you can't post anymore, or you shouldn't be able to post anymore. So hopefully that'll steer you in the right direction. So again, I apologize that we had to do that, but it is the way that it's going to go from here on out. That also brings up the commenting question. So I had a system where everybody was going through and commenting. It isn't going to work the same way. And so I'm kind of working through it. I think I'm going to be able to use the peer review process in Canvas, but I'm going to, because this is the first time we're going through it, I'm only going to do it on the assignments. I'm not going to do it on the exercises. So you'll have far fewer comments to make over the course of this semester, but I still am going to try to get you to make comments. It probably means I'm going to try to have you have a little bit wordier comments, but we'll get to that when we get to the first assignment. You guys in 136 actually wouldn't be making comments yet anyway, because we're all kind of following along and step by step. So I wouldn't be having you do comments, but that's just kind of a general plan for where we're going. Does anybody, before I move on into today's exercise, does anybody have any specific questions about that shift to Canvas? Or, I mean, you guys are all really well versed at Canvas, so I don't think that's going to be an issue. Nat, go ahead, and then we'll switch to whoever.
Sorry, so can we still use your website to watch the instruction video, or
yes,
you could post again on Canvas?
So all the videos and stuff I'll continue to have on my website. All the lectures will be there. All the posts will be there. All the tutorials will be there. Everything's still there. The difference is that you're turning in your work via Canvas. That's the difference.
Thank you so
much. So I will post the lecture or the exercise and the assignments. They'll be posted on Canvas, so you'll see what you need. But the lectures and everything, I'll post links, but they'll still all be posted on the digital tool site.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. So I think we're set. I think we're going to move on into our actual lecture for today. I'm going to share my screen here. And let me move my Zoom windows around. Bear with me for just a second. Okay, so you should all see the remote desktop. I have that pulled up. And again, just like I did last class, I've already pre-logged into my OneDrive, and I have my keystroke logger up, so you'll be able to see my my keystrokes and what it is that I'm clicking on. Today, we're actually shifting out of Rhino, and moving into some VRay. I want to talk about the basics of VRay and kind of basic material properties and that sort of thing. The reason that I mix these in, so essentially we do a couple days worth of Rhino, and then we pause and we do a class that's in VRay. Then we'll do a couple more days in Rhino. Then we'll pause and do a class in VRay. And that's to kind of build up your skills in both as we go forward. So it's not just all Rhino in the beginning and then all VRay at the end. It's kind of a little bit of both as we go along. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to minimize this. We'll refer back to exercise 204 in just a bit. But I'm going to go ahead and open up Rhino 7. And we'll give it just a second to open up. Perfect. And now for this file, we don't already have a predefined template. So we're gonna actually start with a brand new file here. So let me close everything up. And I'm gonna dock my VRay right there at the top. And let's go ahead and maximize that. And on this brand new file that opened up by default, if I look down here at the bottom, I can see that it's set to be in millimeters. So that's not the unit that I want to be working in. I want to be working in feet and inches. So I'm going to go up to the Tools menu, and I'm going to go to Options. So Tools and then Options. And I'm going to look for units. There it is right there, units. And I'm going to change to inches. And once that's changed, I'll go ahead and say, OK. And now my scene is in inches. So when I start working, I'm going to be working in inches. So we're going to set up this primary view. And what I'm going to ask you to do is work in the perspective view today. So I've double clicked on the perspective viewport, and that's what I'm seeing here. And I want you to create a composition of 5 objects. And these objects don't need to be anything particular, but let's start with like a cube. So I could use my coordinate system. I could say at 4 feet, 4 feet to create that first cube. And then we could say maybe it's 4 feet tall. Like that. And then maybe I'll create a few other objects. I'm just using these solid primitives. So I did the box corner to corner. Maybe I'll do a cylinder next. So let's click maybe here as our center. Let's do a radius of 2 feet. And we can do a height of, I don't know, 6 feet. And then I can come over here and I can choose a different, I don't know, let's do a sphere. And we'll do a radius of 3 feet. And then maybe I'll create, let's see, what else do we want to create here? How about a pyramid? Sure, why not? Now in pyramid, I can choose the number of sides. Right now it's set for 5. I could set 4, depending on what it is that I want. 5's fine. And we'll put this one back here behind our other objects. And then we'll give ourselves a little bit of height there. Now, if you're struggling to see what's actually happening in this scene, it might be helpful to look at this as a shaded view instead of a wireframe. So I can change that by clicking on the arrow next to where it says perspective. So next to the viewport name, and I can change from wireframe to shaded. And so that gives me 4 objects. Let's just do another box over here. We'll do a longer, skinnier box. And there's my 5th object. And what I want is I want to kind of arrange these so that I have kind of a nice little perspective. Oh, notice that my sphere is actually sitting low. So I might want to move that one up. So I can take this sphere. Now, if I just go to transform and then move, it's going to move only in the X and Y plane. It's not going to be moving vertically. So when I initiate the move command, if I go to transform and then move, if I look at my command line here, one of the options is vertical. And so if I click on vertical, I can then click and move it up in space. So this time I'm moving it vertically rather than in the X and Y plane. So there it is. Now I'll just kind of adjust my view a little bit. We'll do something about like that, and that'll work. So before I do my rendering, I'd like to save this view so that I know when I do the rendering, this is the view that I'll always have. Actually, let's move this over just a little bit. Maybe like that. Just adjusting my composition a bit. Okay. I'd like to save this view so that I can come back to it again. So I can do that by coming up again to the viewport name where it says perspective. I can click that down arrow. And then I can go to set view and then named views. And this brings up that little named views dialog box, and you'll see there's the little disk icon for save. So let's save this as render1. So I've typed render1 there. I'll say OK. And you'll see that instead of perspective now as my viewport, it's called render1. And so the advantage here is that if I move this, and then I want to come back to render1, I can go back to set view, and I can now choose render1, and it'll jump me back to that view. It's just like if you worked in SketchUp and you save a scene in SketchUp, this is essentially doing the same thing. We're saving that particular scene. So what I wanted you to do was to create this basic composition of shapes, and then we're going to play around with VRay and actually rendering out these shapes. So I can pull back up my little walkthrough here, and we're going to go through kind of these basic setups, and then I'll spend a lot of time working through the VRay asset editor and explaining what's going on there. But in order to get a good rendering, we need there to be some kind of ground that's established. So right now we only have our objects. I'm going to look over here at my layers. I've got one default layer. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. So I'll click on this new layer button, and we can call this ground, or what I tend to call it is IP for infinite plane. So that infinite plane then is going to become my ground. I'd like that to be the active layer. So I'll change my little check mark so that the infinite plane is the active layer. And then I'm going to look in my VRay tools. And when I look up here in my VRay tools, I'm going to look for a little symbol that looks like kind of like a rectangle with 4 lines off of it with a little infinity sign in it. When I click on that infinite plane tool, it's going to create an infinite plane. Oh, look at that. Please choose VRay as your current renderer. My mistake. Let me go up to render first, go to current renderer, and choose VRay for Rhino. Unfortunately, when they image these lab computers, they didn't set that as the default. So every time you log in, you're going to have to go back to render, current render, and choose VRay for Rhino. Now I can go to that infinite plane button and click on it. And when I do that, it creates a ground for me. So once I have that ground, I'm going to change my layers back so that I'm on the default layer. I'll set that as my current layer. And then over here in the infinite plane, I'm going to click the little padlock icon to lock it. And the reason that I lock it is I don't want to accidentally move the infinite plane. I just want it to sit there in the background. So now that it's been locked, I can't accidentally move it. So I've got an infinite plane set up, but I currently have no light in my scene yet either. So we're going to create a light that's called a basic directional light. It's available right here using the directional light tool. But I think it's really hard to create a directional light without a little guide object. So what I tend to do is I create a box. And I could use this box that I already created, but we'll make another little one over here. I create a box. And then when I choose the directional light, I'm going to snap first. It asks me for the end of the light direction vector. Let me turn on my end snap here. I'm going to orbit, and I'll choose that point right there, the lower point of my box. And then it asks me for the start of the light direction vector. I'll choose the opposite corner of the box. And what that does is it allows me to create that light so that it's kind of pointing down toward my scene. If I were to create a light without using that box, I could say, okay, there's my start, and maybe there's my end. What ends up happening is I have a light that's perfectly flat against the ground plane. And I really don't get good results out of that light. So let's go ahead and delete that one. We'll leave this light here in my scene. And then we'll go ahead and delete this square because we don't need that anymore. All right, so now that I have that and I have my light, we can go ahead and perform my first basic rendering. So if I go to render 01 and I come back here to set view and I go to render 1, we'll reset my view to that saved view so that they're all the same. I've got my light installed. That's good. And now we can go ahead and do a test render. Now, it's probably not going to turn out very well because we haven't set any options in VRay just yet. But let's go ahead and give it a shot. I'll click on this teapot icon, and I'll go ahead and click render. And lo and behold, I didn't have very good results just yet. So that's okay. Let's go in and let's start looking at the VRay rendering options. So what I'll do is I'll click on what's called the VRay Asset Editor, which is this sphere right here. And that brings up really everything that you need to know about VRay. I have a little daughter who decided to come join me right now. So give me 1 second to take her back inside. I'll be right back. Hold on. Sorry about that. That's the consequences of being on Zoom. I'm sure it won't be the last time. Okay, so continuing. What we're going to look at here when I open the VRay Asset Editor, that sphere here, is it's going to bring up this little dialog box, which looks very unassuming to begin with, but this is packed with lots and lots of information in it. So we have a couple different kind of setups. The first thing I want to do is go to the gear icon. And this is going to go through the basic settings of VRay, and it's going to allow me to look at what the default options are, etc. If you're ever struggling, sometimes the easiest thing is to just reset and revert to the default settings. A few of you have done that already, so you can always revert to the default settings and then start fresh on your settings. These should already be the default settings, so I'm not going to worry about it just yet. Under the first little drawer, I have my render engine, which is currently using the CPU. I'm not doing any interactive rendering, so that's turned off. We are going to leave it as progressive, and my quality is set to medium, which in our purposes right now is just fine. When we get to final renderings at the end of the semester, we may bump that up just a little bit. I can close that little expansion, and I can open up the camera expansion. So this is where we control what the camera looks like, how a scene is exposed. This value here, this exposure value, is really the one thing that you're going to be changing. And it's going to control how the rendering turns out, how bright or dark the rendering is. I would suspect that if I change this number to about 13 or 14 right now, we'd get much better results in the rendering. Let me show you. So I've changed that to 14. I'm going to click on the teapot icon. And it's still way too bright because I have no materials, but at least now we're seeing some of the shadows starting to appear. So we'll leave that there at 14, and we'll keep coming down here. I do have the ability to play around with depth of field. We'll get to that much later in the semester. Let me go ahead and close the camera drawer, and we'll open up the render output drawer. There we go. This is what is actually rendering. And so my aspect ratio is set to a widescreen. What I tend to like to do is I just match the viewport. Therefore, what I see is what I get, which is good. It's giving me an aspect ratio of 2000 by 1074. That's fine for our purposes. It's still going to render pretty fast. Sometimes when you do your renderings, you might want to switch over into custom and then change this image width and height. Let me go back to the viewport and see if I can change it there. Match viewport. Yeah, I can still change it there. I can drop the size of the rendering way down just as a test render. But that's when things get long in its rendering. The other option that I have here is to actually save the image. So I can turn this on, and that would automatically save the image to a path that I specify. So I could come over here, I could go into my OneDrive, and I could save it into my OneDrive folder. It's not a bad idea to protect yourself, but for our purposes right now, I'm not going to turn it on. We're not dealing with any animations yet. We're not addressing environment settings yet. We'll get to that. Material override takes away all the materials and gives us just the default material. And the VRay swarm allows us to use multiple computers to do rendering. So those are things that we'll touch on a little bit later. All that being said, there's also a whole series of options in the drawer to the right. So if I click that little arrow on the right side, we get a whole nother set of options. So we have render parameters, and this is starting to get into very specific information. We have global illumination. We have how the renderings are going to happen. We can turn on a volumetric environment. That basically is like fog. These are all settings that we can play around with. We're not going to get to those today, but I like to point out that they're there. Okay, let's see. Brooks asking, sorry, I missed that a little bit ago. Brooks asking if the shapes that I did in Rhino are solid object. They're actually, these are, everything that we draw in Rhino is what's called a NURBS object. It's defined as a surface. And so we're viewing it as if it were solid, but it is in fact hollow inside. And so Rhino defines it mathematically as a surface. So it's not like SolidWorks where it's considered a solid object and you're pulling a chunk out of that object. But that also, because of how it's defined, gives us infinite flexibility over the complexity of a particular surface and how smooth it is or not smooth that surface is. So they're not solid objects. It's a great question. Okay, so I have my basic render settings established. Now we're going to start talking about materials. Sounded like I had a question.
Yeah, do you mind showing your settings for the render part again, please?
The render what?
The settings for the render part.
The render part.
Doing, right? Yeah.
Sure. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So my settings for the render part right there, right? These are all basically defaults. So we're leaving the quality at medium for right now. And the rest of these should be. The next one, camera, right? The only thing I've really changed so far is the exposure value. And I bumped that up from 10 to 14.
All right, cool. Thank you.
All right, no problem.
I also had a question on how to save it so that it opens in Rhino and not an image.
When you're saving your Rhino file?
Yeah, is there a way to save it so that it opens into Rhino?
Yes, yes, I'll show you that. Basically, in Rhino, all you need to do is go to File and then Save. And what Rhino is saving is a Rhino 7 3D model. So it's going to be a .3dm file. That will always open Rhino when you save that. So I would save that, and actually it's probably a good place for me to stop and do it anyway before I lose things. Let me go into today's folder. And I actually need a folder for today. Here we go, spring 2022. And 204. And let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so that Rhino 3dm file, if I were to close Rhino and then double click that file, it would open and give me this exact same scene. It preserves everything in Rhino, but it also preserves all the VRay settings. So you get, even though VRay is a plugin for Rhino, it will save all the VRay settings with your file as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So let me get open the VRay asset editor again. There it is. Now, if I expand the drawer to the left, this side, this is all about the materials that are there. And so by default, none of the materials have been downloaded. And this is one of those things that's so frustrating because they didn't do it before they imaged the machine. So every time we have to do this when we log in. There's a button here for download. If I click on download, it will start downloading the whole texture pack that comes with VRay. So this will take a few minutes for it to download. In the meantime, I'm going to go over to this first button here, which is the materials button. And when I click on that, I have the ability to create a new material. We'll get to using the actual live materials here. but I'm going to create a new generic material. So I click on that materials button and I'm going to click on generic. And when I do that, it's listed as generic. I'm going to rename it. We'll rename it to be red. So I've created a material called red. If I expand the drawer to the right now, I can see specific properties about my material. So I was telling you that this asset editor gets complicated because there's drawers out to each side. So the red material, I can see a preview here, but it is currently just gray. The color of the material is identified by this diffuse setting. So right now the color is set as gray. Let's go ahead and change that color to red. So I'm going to click on the gray area here and we'll change this. You know what? I want that color to be red. And you can see that I can pick any color of red that I would want. And when I've picked red, you can see that my material updates to be red. Now, if I want that red material to apply to one of my objects in my scene, I can click on that object, and then I can right click on the name of the material here and say apply to selection. I can also apply to a layer, but for our purposes right now, we're going to apply to each object. So I'm going to apply to the selection. And there we go. So I've applied it, and the logical question is, well, wait a minute, why am I not seeing it? And that's because the view mode that we're looking in right now is just shaded. It's giving us generic objects. This is great for modeling, but not so great for materials. So I can switch from shaded mode into rendered mode. Now, sometimes the rendered mode works wonderfully, and sometimes it doesn't work at all. And a few of you ran into this problem where you tried to do rendered mode and it just turned black on you. That can happen. Usually when you have a light in the scene, like the directional light that I installed earlier, we won't have it just turn black, but be aware that sometimes it does in fact happen. So I've created one material that's red. The rest of my preview is showing as white. So let's go ahead and create a few more materials. So I'm going to create another material. Now this time, when I click on that materials button, I've already have a material. So I actually need to come all the way down to the bottom. There's a little plus sign where I can create a new material. There we go, generic. And this time, instead of being red, I don't know, let's call it blue. You kind of see where I'm going with this. And let's change the material color to be blue. So I'll come down here on the color picker and I'll pick blue. We can see that it updates, and I can pick my object and I can right click and say apply to selection. So now I have a red object and a blue object in my scene. I still want to fill it out with some more colors. So let me go back to the VRay asset editor and click on the plus sign. I'm going to go to materials. I'm going to go to generic. And I don't know, I'm not sure what to name it because I haven't decided yet. Let's say this is green. So let's pick green there. And we'll rename that material to be green. Perfect. And we can assign that material to another one of my objects. So let's right click and say apply to selection. And now that object is green. So we'll do this 2 more times with 2 more colors. Let's go down here and create a new generic material. And let's call this one orange. And we'll change the color to be orange. There's orange. Let's apply it here. So let me right click on orange and say apply to selection. And we need 1 more material. So I'll come down to that little plus sign. We'll go to materials, generic. And let's call this one pink. And we'll change this to be a pink. Okay. So we'll use that last cylinder. We'll right click on it and we'll say apply to selection. So now all 5 of my objects have a material assigned to them. So when we go in and do the render, so if I click on the teapot icon, we should be able to see all of my materials nicely. we'll let the rendering progress a little bit, and this is where some patience is good. We could see that we're actually getting shadow being cast off of these. That's good as well. A little bit of shadow on the curve there. And we can see down here at the bottom that my render now says finished. That means that the render has completed, and I can go ahead and save it. So there's a disk icon here that will allow me to save my render. I'm going to click on it, and it's going to bring up the choose output image file. This is where you want to put it. And I'm going to go into my OneDrive. Let me go into today's lecture. Brooke, I'm going to get to your question in just a second. And let me go into here. Okay, so this is my first example. I'm going to change the save as type to be a JPEG. The PNG is fine, but sometimes the background becomes transparent and you get a black background and what have you. So let's change it to a JPEG, and we'll call this exercise 204, and this is 1. And we'll click on save. And that saves a JPEG, and that's what I'm going to post. This is one of the things that I'm going to post to Canvas. So now Brooke's question is a really good one, and that is, can we mess around with other settings making the new material? So that's where we're going. So we've created the materials to start with. Now we're going to start changing settings so you can see how these materials change. So let's go to the VRay asset editor, and I'm going to pick the blue material to start. So when we have the blue material here, we've changed the diffuse color. But you see below that, I have other options for what's happening in this material. So the first option would be my reflection. So if I expand the reflection, I can actually assign a reflective set of group of settings to it. So we're going to come down here, and then we're going to change the reflection IOR value. So that's what we want to start with. So I'm going to click on, and of course it's not letting me. Let me see. There we go. It wants me to adjust the slider first. So let's right now the reflection is set as black. If we change this slider up, you can see that it's going from partially reflective all the way to fully reflective. So that reflection color, let's slide it all the way up. And why is it not letting me turn on? There we go. There's my IOR. So this reflection IOR is actually a value that's very important. And it determines how reflective the material is, or what it looks like from a reflectivity standpoint. And where it really starts to matter is I can actually look up, let's say I was trying to create a material, I can look up standard IOR values table. And you can see that different materials have different IOR values. So glass, for example, is somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7. A diamond, 2.418. Right? So we can actually go here. This is a list of IOR values for known materials. So we can actually scroll down here, and depending on what material you're trying to create, titanium, for example, 2.16. I don't even know what some of these are. Chalk, 1.51. Right, so there's all kinds of different examples here. So what I want you to do, now that we've turned that on, is I want you to mess around with the settings. That one's at 1.6, but let's say that we went to, say, 4. You can see how much more reflective that material becomes. If we were trying to create like a chrome, like a really polished material, we'd go all the way up to maybe 8. And this is blue tinted chrome, but it's very, very reflective. So a diamond is 2.1. Let's leave it at 2.1. And there it is. We can do this for other materials. So we've got it set for the blue. Let's go to green. Let's open up reflection. Let's turn that one on. And let's change the IOR to, I don't know, maybe, let's go to maybe 1. No, that's not reflective at all. Let's go to 1.1. Sorry, wrong value, 1.1. So that's more like a plastic would be, where we have a little bit of reflectivity, but not too much. Maybe 1.2 shows it a little bit better. Yeah, just a little bit. So we're able to control how much reflection these various materials have. We could go over to the pink one here. We could turn on reflection for the pink one. Turn on IOR, and we'll leave that one at 1.6. Okay, so that's the reflection of a material. Let's close down reflection. Let's close down diffuse. And let's move down to the next one, which is opacity. It used to be called transparency. Now it's called opacity. And we can actually control how much opacity this has using this slider. So if I come down here, you can see that it's more transparent. It's more transparent. And if I come all the way down to the bottom, it's completely transparent, regardless of color. So let's set this one about halfway. Maybe like that. And then let's go ahead and perform an actual rendering and see what it looks like. So as it's rendering out here, you can see that these objects are still relatively solid, but the blue object is now reflective. It's reflecting the ground that's white. It's also reflecting this ball, and it would be reflecting on the backside. There's a little bit of reflection on the top. That's normal. We'll let it finish its rendering. There we go. It's finished. I'm going to go ahead and save this. So this is my second image. Let's switch it over to JPEG again. And we'll call this 204-2. There we go. And then I'll keep adjusting these settings. Let's play around with the blue one. I'm going to go to the blue. We can minimize these two, and we'll come down to the opacity. And let's adjust that so that it's much more transparent. Maybe like that. Now we can also, there's a value called refraction. And so this has to do with how light passes through clear objects. And it's a little bit advanced for what we're doing today, but if the best way of describing it is if you had a glass and you filled it with water and you set it on your counter and you shined a light through it, the light would go through the glass and then bend and hit the water and then bend again and then come through. And so we can choose how that's happening in these various materials. So again, it's pretty sophisticated, but we could by default just turn it on. Okay, you can see that it's becoming much more transparent. We're getting much less of the color there. And now it's becoming almost like an entirely glass object. And so anyway, I don't think it shows it well enough, and we're not going to get too much out of it. We could change the fog color to tint the glass a certain color, but I think this is probably getting above our heads for today. So let me keep that one off, and we'll stick with just the basic bluish color. We're not going to worry about coating. Bump is a way of applying texture to an object. We're going to not worry about that just yet. We'll cover that more in a couple lectures. So now that I've created that, let me go back into my orange. Maybe this one needs a little bit of reflection too. So we'll turn that one on. And let's come down here and let's go to opacity and let's give it just a bit of opacity. And we'll perform one last render. So now we're seeing through the blue object. This actually brings up a good point. You can see at the bottom of this blue object that I'm getting kind of a weird pattern. Let me zoom in on it a little bit. I'm getting kind of weird lines and whatever. VRay does not play well when two surfaces are exactly coplanar, when they intersect exactly in the same spot. It gives us these weird artifacts. So in this scenario, to eliminate that, I need to adjust that infinite plane or all of my objects. Let me switch back to shaded mode for just a second so we can see it. And let me jump out of, let me close the asset editor. Let me jump into the front view for a second. And we can see that the infinite plane, this line right there, is coplanar with all of my shapes. So if I were to take all of my shapes and move them just a bit above the plane, you know, it could be as simple, let me turn on ortho here, could be as simple as a 1/16 of an inch. So I could say 0.125 inches. It's just a whisker up there. If I were to zoom in like that, you can see there's that little tiny gap. Alternatively, I could move the infinite plane down by a 1/16 of an inch. I could also move it arbitrarily. Now, when I come back to my render and I re-render that, oops. Let's stop the render. Let's re-render it. We can see that that artifacting that was happening goes away completely. So we're not seeing it anymore. So let me zoom out. We can see our transparency. We can see that shadow there, which is really nice. So all of this is working well. So as soon as this is done, I'm going to go ahead and save that image as well. So you can see that when I add the reflections and when I add the transparency, the rendering time goes up. So it takes much longer for the renders to finish. A lot more calculations to happen. VRay, by the way, will follow a beam of light up to 16 reflections. And that's part of how we get such accurate renderings long-term with VRay, is because it's following that beam of light that many times. So we're almost done here. There we go. And now we're finished. So I can go ahead and save this one as well. So I'm going to save it as a JPEG. And this will be 204-3. We'll click save. Now the next piece would be to take all of these objects and apply different materials to them. So we created materials from scratch, all of these, but you see that my material library has just finished downloading. And I mentioned this a little bit on the first day, but I can go into any one of these materials. I could use bricks, for example. I could select this wall. I could right click and I could say apply to selection. And now the bricks are going to be applied on that wall looking object. If I switch over into rendered mode, we should see a preview of it. Now, they don't always look perfect when you apply a material, especially one with a pattern. That's something that's called texture mapping, and it's something that we'll work on later on in the semester. So if you apply it and you don't like it, you could try a different type of material. I could come in here, for example, and I could apply a green porcelain. Let's apply that to the selection. And now I have a green porcelain. I could select this cone here. We could come down into leather, and I could apply black leather to it, apply to the selection. I could pick this here, and we could get to, I don't know, stone, and I could apply granite to it, apply to selection. So I'd like you to go through and on each of these objects, apply a different kind of material. There's a blue foam. How about that? Let's apply to selection there. And the last one is this sphere. I don't know, we haven't done a metal yet, so let's do a metal. And we can apply to the selection. So now that I've done that, we'll go ahead and render again. So I'll click that little teapot icon and we'll render it out with actual materials on it. And you can see there's problems with texture, like the leather is definitely too big, but you can see if you were to zoom in on that a little bit, that it really does look like leather. This really does look like granite. And again, we'll increase the size and the quality of the renderings as we go forward, but this shows you how to apply basic materials to your objects. So I'd like you to go through and apply to all 5 of the objects different material. And as soon as that's done rendering, we'll go ahead and save that as well. Oops, sorry, we just need the regular save. There we go. And let's go into JPEG. And this is 204-4. And we'll click save. All right, and so the last thing that I'm going to ask you to do as part of your 204, and this is really, hopefully it works, and hopefully you're ready for it. If you're not, it's okay. Let me go to File and then Open. And I'm going to open my walls from last class. So let's go into my last class. And let's open up those walls. So, and this is where if it didn't work out, where you didn't save it or something didn't work the way you wanted it to, that's okay. You can just skip this part. I'll still give you credit for the exercise, but I'd like you to get to this stage, and I'd like you to select the objects that are in this scene. So we've got, I'm going to hold down Shift here. I've got the tops of the doors and my walls, and then I will apply a material to that. So let me open my VRay settings here. I'll go into my materials and let's put concrete on these walls. So let's see if we have, I'm going to do simple concrete and I'll apply that to the selection. So now I have a basic concrete that's applied. If I were to look at this in rendered mode, we should be able to see it. There it is. Now, the texture doesn't quite look right, but I do have to set up a few more things like we did in the beginning. I create a new layer, and we'll call that layer infinite plane, IP. I'll make it active, and I'll create that infinite plane underneath my object. That's good. That gives me a ground. The next thing I need to do is create that light. That's going to be my basic directional light. So I'll create a temporary little box like that. And I'm going to switch into the shaded mode because in the rendered mode, I won't actually see the light that I'm creating. Let me switch into the shaded mode, and I'll click on this basic directional light, and we'll snap from the lower corner diagonally to the upper corner, and then we can delete the box, and that gives me my light. I told you it wouldn't show up in the rendered view. Let me just confirm that for you. See how the light is no longer there in the rendered view? So I wanted to make sure that it was showing before I switched back into the rendered view. Then we'll go ahead and check on my options here. So let's go to my settings. It looks like the exposure value is already set at 13.6. That should be okay. It should be pretty close to what I want. And let's go ahead and render this. So I'll click on the teapot. And it's rendered out. This actually has some older settings in it. That's why we're seeing a different style of rendering. Yours will be the new style of rendering. There we go. And we can see the shadow. So everything turned out pretty well. I'm going to save this as my last file for today. So let me click on the save button here. We'll save it again as a JPEG. And this will be 204-5. If you didn't save it, I'm okay. If you skip this or if something doesn't work out, you don't do the material on this, that's okay. It's redundant. It's about learning how to make these, how to work through, how to put the infinite plane in, get the light in, get the rendering started, etc. So play around with the materials, have some fun with it, enjoy making the materials more or less reflective, see what happens. Those are all good experimental things to work on. We're just about out of time, so I'm gonna let everybody go here, but I encourage you to work on that. I have some groups scheduled to check in today. If you're in my first group, please just stay on and we'll get through the check-in. If you are feeling a little bit lost, you need to catch up, even if it's not your time, you're more than welcome to come and ask me some questions. It's not particularly, I'm guessing it's not going to be particularly busy today. So we will go from there. Are there any questions for the whole group? Doesn't sound like it. So you're free to go. Those of you that are in my first group, please stick around and I'll get you checked off for your check-in.